People often
Moving
think
forward,
silence
I
means
propose we
weakness.
focus on
They think the
expanding our
loudest
digital
voice
outreach
wins, the
strategy
boldest
to
move
enhance our
matters, the
market
one who
presence.
talks the most must know the most. That's what everyone believed in that small town, especially when it came to her. She sat near the window every morning, sipping the same cup of tea, watching the world rush by as if it had somewhere important to be. Most people never noticed her. Those who did barely remembered her name. And that was exactly why no one saw what was coming. This is a story about a quiet woman, and why you should never underestimate the power of someone who listens more than she speaks. Her name was Mira. She wasn't mysterious in the dramatic sense. She didn't wear dark clothes or hide in corners. She simply lived softly. She spoke when needed, smiled politely, and never interrupted. In meetings, she took notes while others argued. In family gatherings, she washed dishes while everyone else debated old stories. People labeled her as shy, passive, maybe even weak. It wasn't said out loud, but it lived in the pauses, in the way conversations moved on without waiting for her input. Mira noticed all of it. She always did. What people didn't understand was that Mira's silence was never empty. It was full. Full of observation, patience, and a deep sense of awareness. While others rushed to prove themselves, she watched patterns. While others reacted, she reflected. She remembered details others forgot. The quiet woman saw who lied when nervous, who avoided eye contact when hiding something, who spoke loudly to mask insecurity. Her strength wasn't in confrontation. It was in clarity. Mira worked at a modest office where ambition echoed louder than integrity. Promotions went to the most confident speakers, not the most consistent workers. She stayed late, finished tasks without complaint, and helped co-workers without taking credit. Some called her nice. Others called her invisible. Her manager barely acknowledged her presence unless something went wrong. And when mistakes happened, it was often the quiet ones who were blamed because they wouldn't argue back. Mira accepted it all with calm eyes and steady breath. At home, life wasn't much different. Expectations were heavy, appreciation was light. She was the reliable one, the one who would understand, the one who wouldn't make a fuss. People leaned on her strength without ever naming it. And still she remained quiet. Not because she didn't feel, but because she was choosing her moment. Silence for her was not surrender. It was preparation. There was a moment, though, when even patience feels tested. It came on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that doesn't warn you it's about to change everything. A decision was made without her. Credit was taken that wasn't earned. A line was crossed so casually that it stunned her. The room buzzed with voices, laughter, confidence. Mira sat there, hands folded, heart steady, listening. No one noticed the shift inside her. No one saw the calm settle deeper, heavier, more deliberate. That's the thing about a quiet woman. When she finally moves, it's not impulsive. It's precise. Every silence before that moment was a lesson learned. Every dismissal was information stored. Every underestimation was fuel. Mira didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to argue. She only needed to act, and when she did, it would speak louder than any words ever could. Days passed and subtle changes began. Questions were asked in the right places. Records were checked. Conversations happened behind closed doors. People who once ignored Mira now paused when she entered the room, unsure why they suddenly felt unsettled. She was still quiet, still polite, still calm. But something had shifted. The balance was no longer what they thought it was. There's a unique power and resilience that grows unnoticed. A strength that builds in silence is often the strongest of all. Mira wasn't trying to prove anything. She wasn't seeking revenge or recognition. She was simply done being misunderstood. And that decision, quiet as it was, carried weight. The world often celebrates loud victories, dramatic comebacks, bold declarations. But it rarely prepares you for the quiet woman who has been watching the whole time. The one who knows exactly when to speak and when to stay silent. The one who doesn't announce her strength because she doesn't need permission to use it. As the truth slowly edged closer to the surface, tension filled the air. People sensed change but couldn't name it. Mira remained exactly as she always had been on the outside. Same calm face. Same gentle tone. Same quiet presence. But inside, everything was aligned. The pieces were in place. And just when everyone assumed she would let it go like always, Mira stood up. Not dramatically. Not angrily. She simply stood, looked around the room, and spoke one sentence. A sentence so clear, so grounded, that it stopped everything. What she said next would change how they saw her forever. The room didn't erupt after Mira spoke that single sentence. It went quiet in a way that felt heavier than noise. Chairs stopped creaking. Papers stopped shuffling. Even the air seemed to pause. No one expected her voice, not because it was soft, but because it was certain. Calm certainty is unsettling when people are used to control through volume. A few eyes met hers, then quickly looked away. Others tried to laugh it off, but the laughter didn't land. Something had shifted, and everyone felt it, even if they didn't understand why. Mira didn't say anything more. She didn't need to. She sat back down, picked up her pen, and continued writing like nothing unusual had happened. But for the first time, people were watching her instead of ignoring her. Her manager cleared his throat and moved on with the meeting, but the rhythm was broken. The confidence he usually carried felt thinner now. He avoided looking in her direction. Mira noticed. She always noticed. What most people in that room didn't know was how long this moment had been building. Mira hadn't always been this controlled. Years ago, she had spoken up when something felt unfair. She had trusted that honesty would be enough. It wasn't. Each time she expressed concern, it was brushed aside or reframed as sensitivity. Each time she explained herself, her words were twisted. Over time, she learned that being heard wasn't about speaking more. It was about speaking smarter. Her quiet nature wasn't something she was born with. It was shaped. Shaped by being interrupted. Shaped by being overlooked. Shaped by learning that people reveal more when they think no one is paying attention. Mira became skilled at listening without reacting, at storing information without showing emotion. While others underestimated her silence, she used it as a shield. Outside the office, the town moved slowly, wrapped in routines and familiar faces. Everyone knew everyone, or at least thought they did. Stories traveled fast, but truths moved carefully. Mira had lived there long enough to understand how reputations were built and broken. Loud confidence was admired. Quiet consistency was ignored. Until it wasn't. Her evenings were simple. A walk home. A small apartment with warm lighting. Shelves filled with books people had lent her and never asked about again. She read a lot. Not just stories but people. She replayed conversations in her mind, not with bitterness but with curiosity. Why did someone hesitate before answering? Why did another rush to explain? These questions weren't obsessions. They were patterns. There was one person, though, who had always made her uneasy. Not because he was loud, but because he was polished. He knew exactly what to say and when to say it. He took credit easily and passed blame smoothly. Around others he smiled. Around Mira he barely acknowledged her. He assumed her silence meant ignorance. That assumption was his comfort. What he didn't realize was that Mira remembered things. Dates. Emails. Conversations that didn't match later versions of events. She never confronted him. She never hinted that she knew more than she let on. She simply kept listening. And over time the picture became clearer. The sentence she had spoken in that meeting wasn't random. It was carefully chosen. It wasn't an accusation, but it wasn't harmless either. It was a reminder. A reminder that details mattered. That records existed. That stories could be checked. It planted a seed of doubt, and doubt spreads quietly. After that day, people started treating her differently. Not with respect exactly, but with caution. Some coworkers suddenly became friendly, asking questions they had never asked before. Others kept their distance, unsure where she stood. Mira remained the same. Polite, focused, observant. She didn't rush the change. She allowed it to unfold. At home, she reflected on how easily power shifts when silence meets preparation. She wasn't planning a confrontation. She wasn't chasing validation. What she wanted was balance, truth. A moment where her voice, when used, would matter. And that moment was still approaching. The town itself seemed to mirror the tension. Whispers replaced certainty. People noticed small inconsistencies they had ignored before. A report that didn't add up. A story that changed slightly each time it was told. Mira didn't point these things out. She didn't need to. Once people start questioning, they do the work themselves. Still, there was a risk. Quiet strength is often mistaken for patience without limits. Mira knew that stepping forward, even subtly, would draw attention. And attention can be dangerous when others feel exposed. She was aware of the stakes. She felt them in the way conversations stopped when she walked by. In the way her name was suddenly mentioned more often. One evening she received a message that made her pause. It was brief. Polite. Too polite. Someone wanted to talk things through. Someone who had never wanted her opinion before. Mira read it twice, then set her phone down. She didn't respond right away. Silence once again gave her space to think. She stood by her window watching the town lights flicker on. From the outside, everything looked calm. Ordinary. But underneath, tension was tightening like a held breath. Mira wasn't afraid. She was alert. She understood that being underestimated had given her time. And time used well becomes power. The quiet woman didn't rush toward the spotlight. She didn't announce her intentions. She simply waited, knowing that the truth had a way of surfacing when people least expect it. And when it did, it wouldn't be loud. Somewhere in the town, someone was starting to realize they had misjudged her. And that realization came with fear. Mira picked up her phone again, her expression unreadable. Whatever she chose to do next would set things in motion that couldn't be undone. She took a slow breath, steady and calm, just as she always had. The quiet had not ended yet. It was only getting deeper. Mira decided not to reply to the message that night. Not because she was avoiding it, but because she wanted to understand why it had been sent now. Timing always reveals intention. She placed the phone face down on the table and let the silence sit with her. Silence had always been her ally. It gave people space to show their true selves, and it gave her clarity. The next morning the office felt different again. Not openly tense, but alert, like everyone was listening for something they couldn't hear yet. Mira noticed small things. A coworker who usually joked too much was suddenly serious. Another avoided eye contact altogether. Her manager greeted her with an unfamiliar politeness, asking if she needed anything. Mira smiled and said no. She meant it. What she needed couldn't be handed to her. As she settled into her work, she became aware of how many eyes were drawn to her movements. Every note she took, every pause she made felt observed. For years she had been invisible. Now her quiet presence felt like a question mark in the room. People didn't know what she knew, and not knowing made them uneasy. From Myra's perspective, nothing had changed about who she was. She still valued peace, honesty and balance. But she had reached a point where remaining silent out of habit would mean betraying herself. That internal shift was subtle but powerful. It gave her a steadiness that others mistook for confidence. In reality, it was alignment. Across the room, the polished man watched her carefully. He masked it well, pretending to focus on his screen, but Mira felt his attention. He had always underestimated her, treating her silence as absence. Now her presence felt too loud for his comfort. He replayed that sentence she had spoken in the meeting over and over in his mind, trying to decide if it was a warning or a coincidence. From his point of view, things were starting to feel unstable. He had built his position on charm and control. He knew how to shape stories, how to redirect blame, how to speak just enough truth to sound believable. But he wasn't used to being questioned quietly. Loud challenges could be dismissed. Calm ones lingered. He told himself Mira was harmless. He had done so for years. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that she had been watching him longer than he realized. Meanwhile, another coworker began noticing things too. She had always admired Mira from a distance, seeing something strong beneath the softness. Watching the shift in the office, she wondered if Mira had finally decided to step into her power. The thought was both comforting and frightening. Comforting because someone like Mira deserved to be heard. Frightening because change often came with consequences. At lunch, conversations were cautious. Names were avoided. Jokes felt forced. Mira ate quietly, listening more than usual. People spoke around her, not to her, as if unsure which version of her they were dealing with. She let them wonder. Uncertainty had its own weight. Later that afternoon, Mira received another message. This one more direct. A request for a private conversation. No urgency, but an edge beneath the politeness. She read it once and didn't respond. Not yet. She wanted to see who would grow impatient. That evening she walked home slowly, the sky dimming above her. She thought about how often quiet women are told to be patient, to wait their turn, to keep the peace. No one talks about how patience can sharpen awareness, how waiting can reveal truth. Mira wasn't interested in proving anyone wrong. She was interested in standing firm in what she knew. At home she opened an old notebook. Inside were dates, observations, things that hadn't made sense at the time but now formed a pattern. She had never planned to use it against anyone. It was simply a record, a way to make sense of her surroundings. Seeing it now, she understood its weight. Knowledge, once gathered, doesn't disappear. In another part of town, conversations were happening without her. People were comparing notes, realizing that certain stories didn't line up. No one accused anyone outright. It was more subtle than that. A raised eyebrow. Pause. A quiet, "That's strange." Myra's single sentence had started something she hadn't fully anticipated. Not chaos but awareness. The polished man felt it too. He made a few calls, sent a few messages trying to secure reassurance. But reassurance felt thinner than usual. People were less responsive, less certain. He told himself it was nothing, that things would settle. Still, he found himself watching Mira more closely, searching her face for clues. She gave him none. From Myra's side, the tension was exhausting but necessary. She knew that stepping forward, even quietly, often invites resistance. People protect the versions of themselves they've shown the world. When those versions are threatened, they push back. Mira prepared herself for that, not with anger but with grounding. One afternoon, as she was leaving the office, someone stopped her. A coworker she barely knew. He hesitated, then said softly that he respected her. That he had noticed how she carried herself. That he thought she was braver than people realized. Mira thanked him and kept walking. His words stayed with her, not because she needed validation, but because they reminded her she wasn't alone. That night, she finally replied to the message. Her response was short, neutral, agreeing to talk but on her terms. She suggested a time and place that felt safe, open, and public. Boundaries mattered. Silence didn't mean vulnerability. As the days led up to that meeting, the atmosphere grew heavier. Whispers followed her. People speculated about what she might say, what she might do. Mira stayed focused, refusing to be pulled into the noise. She knew that the real conflict wasn't about one conversation or one person. It was about long-standing assumptions. About who gets heard and who gets overlooked. The quiet woman had disrupted the balance without raising her voice, and that disruption was still unfolding. On the morning of the scheduled conversation, Mira stood in front of her mirror for a moment longer than usual. She didn't rehearse what she would say. She didn't need to. She trusted herself now. Trusted the calm that had carried her this far. As she stepped out into the day, she felt the weight of what was coming, not as fear but as responsibility. Whatever happened next would ripple outward. She knew that. And so did the people who had underestimated her for far too long. The meeting hadn't happened yet. The truth hadn't been spoken out loud. But the tension was already alive, stretching between silence and revelation, waiting for the moment when it would finally demand to be heard. The day of the meeting arrived with a strange stillness, the kind that feels too quiet to be real. Mira noticed it the moment she stepped outside. The streets looked the same, people moved the same, but something underneath felt tense, like the world was holding its breath. She walked steadily, her pace unhurried, even though her thoughts were sharp and alert. This wasn't nervousness. It was awareness. At the office, everyone seemed to know something was coming, though no one could say what. Conversation stopped when Mira entered a room. Phones were checked more often than usual. People pretended to work while listening for footsteps. The quiet woman had become the center of a storm she never announced, and that made it more powerful. When noise leads, people prepare. When silence leads, people panic. The polished man arrived earlier than usual. His smile was in place, but it didn't reach his eyes. He had spent the night replaying every interaction he'd ever had with Mira, searching for cracks. He told himself again that she was harmless, that she wouldn't dare challenge him openly. Still, he had brought documents with him just in case. Protection, he called it. Control, really? From another angle, Myra's manager felt uneasy. He had ignored small warning signs for years because things seemed to work on the surface. Now those signs were impossible to ignore. Productivity was down, trust was thin, and one quiet woman had somehow shifted the balance without making demands. He wondered if he had underestimated her too. That thought made him uncomfortable. As the morning moved forward, tension tightened. Mira focused on her work, but her senses were tuned outward. She noticed how often her name was mentioned in hushed tones. She noticed how people watched her reactions, trying to read meaning into every expression. She gave them nothing. Calm has a way of making others project their fears. The time for the meeting drew closer. It was scheduled for late afternoon in a small conference room with glass walls. Open enough to feel safe, closed enough to feel serious. Mira had chosen it deliberately. Transparency mattered. She didn't want shadows. She wanted clarity. In the hours leading up to it, messages came in. Some encouraging. Some cautious. Some pretending nothing was happening at all. Mira didn't respond to most of them. She knew that once you start explaining yourself too early, you lose control of the narrative. The quiet woman understood timing better than anyone. Across the office, the polished man tried to act normal. He laughed a little louder than usual. He spoke confidently in meetings. But those who knew him well could sense the strain. Confidence when forced sounds hollow. He glanced at the clock more often than he realized. Waiting was not his strength. There was a subplot unfolding that Mira wasn't fully aware of yet. Two co-workers, tired of being overlooked themselves, had started comparing experiences. Nothing dramatic. Just sharing small frustrations. But in doing so, they realized how often the same name appeared at the center of their problems. Patterns began to emerge. Quietly. Naturally. Myra's presence had given others permission to look closer. As afternoon light filtered through the windows, the office felt heavy. Mira stood up to get a glass of water, and the room followed her movement without meaning to. She felt it and almost smiled. Not out of pride, but out of understanding. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it's felt. When the time finally came, she didn't rush. She gathered her things slowly, stood with ease, and walked toward the conference room. Each step felt grounded. She wasn't walking into a battle. She was walking into truth. That difference mattered to her. The polished man was already there, seated, documents neatly arranged. He stood when she entered, offered a practiced smile. Mira returned a polite nod and sat across from him. The glass walls made everything visible. People passed by, pretending not to look but listening anyway. The room itself felt like a witness. They exchanged simple words at first. Neutral. Professional. Almost friendly. But beneath the surface, tension pulsed. Every pause carried weight. Every word felt measured. Mira listened more than she spoke, just as she always had. He spoke more than usual, filling space, trying to steer the conversation. Mira let him. As he talked, she noticed small things. The way his tone shifted when certain topics came up. The way his hand tightened around his pen. These details confirmed what she already knew. Silence had taught her to read what others missed. Outside the room, whispers spread. People speculated about what was being said. Some hoped for resolution. Others feared exposure. The office had become a place of waiting, caught between old comfort and possible change. Inside, the conversation grew heavier. Not louder, just denser. Mira asked a question. Simple. Direct. Not accusatory. The polished man paused before answering. That pause was everything. Mira didn't interrupt it. She let it stretch, knowing that discomfort reveals more than confrontation. From his perspective, things were slipping. He realized she wasn't there to argue. She wasn't emotional. She wasn't defensive. That made her dangerous. He tried to regain control by offering explanations, justifications, versions of events. Mira listened, eyes steady, expression unreadable. At one point, she opened her notebook. Not the old one, but a clean page. Still, the act alone made him tense. He didn't know what she had written before, and not knowing was the worst part. Assumptions filled the gap, and they weren't kind. Time seemed to slow. Outside the glass walls, the office buzzed with quiet anticipation. People checked their phones, pretended to work, waited for a signal. No one knew how this would end, but everyone knew it mattered. Mira finally spoke again. Not to accuse, not to threaten, but to clarify. Her voice was calm, steady, grounded. Each word felt deliberate. The room felt smaller, tighter. The polished man leaned back slightly, his confidence faltering just enough to be noticeable. This was the edge. The point where silence and truth met. Mira felt it. He felt it. The office felt it. Whatever came next would change things. Not just for them, but for everyone who had been watching quietly, waiting to see what happens when a quiet woman finally steps fully into her power. The conversation wasn't over. The tension hadn't broken. But the moment before the storm had arrived, and there was no turning back now. The moment stretched longer than either of them expected. Myra's last words still hovered in the air, calm but heavy, like a truth that refused to settle quietly. The polished man opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. For the first time, he wasn't sure which version of the story would protect him best. He had always relied on confidence to guide him through moments like this. Now, confidence felt unreliable. Before he could speak, there was a soft knock on the glass wall. Both of them turned. The manager stood there, hesitant, his expression tight. He gestured, asking if he could join them. The request sounded polite, but it wasn't optional. Mira nodded without hesitation. The polished man forced a smile that didn't hide his irritation. As the manager took a seat, the dynamic shifted instantly. This was no longer a private conversation. This was a situation. Mira remained calm, her posture relaxed, but inside she recognized the shift for what it was. Someone had sensed the tension and stepped closer to the truth. That alone raised the stakes. The manager began by saying he wanted clarity. Just clarity. The word sounded harmless, but it carried weight. Mira listened as he spoke about concerns, inconsistencies, and the general unease spreading through the office. He didn't accuse anyone. He didn't name names. But his eyes drifted briefly toward the polished man. That glance said more than words ever could. From the polished man's perspective, the room felt smaller. The glass walls no longer felt like protection. They felt like exposure. He responded smoothly at first, explaining processes, decisions, timelines. He had rehearsed these explanations in his mind many times. But something was different now. Mira wasn't interrupting. She wasn't reacting. She was letting him build his version fully. Then she did something unexpected. She slid a single printed page across the table. No speech. No warning. Just the paper. The polished man froze for half a second before picking it up. His eyes scanned the page and the color drained from his face just enough to be noticed. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. The manager leaned forward slightly, curiosity sharpening his expression. Mira spoke softly. She explained that the page wasn't an accusation. It was a question. A record. A small piece of a much larger picture. She said she had noticed discrepancies over time. Not just once. Not just with one project. Patterns. Quiet patterns that only became visible when you stopped rushing. The room felt heavier. Outside, a few co-workers slowed their steps as they passed by, sensing something important unfolding. Inside, the polished man tried to regain control, but his usual rhythm was gone. He questioned the accuracy of the document, suggested misunderstandings, implied miscommunication. Mira didn't argue. She simply listened. Then came the second twist. The manager revealed that Mira wasn't the only one who had raised quiet concerns. Others had come forward recently. Independently. Without coordination. Small observations that, when combined, painted a troubling picture. The manager admitted he had ignored earlier signs because they were subtle and inconvenient. Now they were impossible to overlook. The polished man leaned back in his chair, the confidence he once wore like armor now visibly cracked. He glanced at Mira, trying to read her, trying to understand how long this had been building. What unsettled him most wasn't the document or the manager's words. It was the realization that Mira had never rushed. She had waited until the truth could speak for itself. Mira felt the tension rise, but she stayed grounded. This wasn't about victory. It was about accountability. She clarified that she hadn't planned to expose anyone. She had simply kept records to protect herself, because quiet people learn early that they must be careful. Her voice never wavered. That honesty landed harder than any accusation could have. Outside the room, speculation turned into certainty. People could sense that something irreversible was happening. The quiet woman who had once been overlooked was now at the center of a reckoning. Some felt inspired. Others felt nervous. Everyone felt the shift. The polished man attempted one last move. He suggested taking the conversation offline, handling it discreetly. The word discreet hung in the air like a warning. Mira met his eyes, her expression calm but firm. She said transparency mattered now. Silence had done its work. It was time for clarity. The manager agreed. That decision alone changed everything. What none of them realized yet was how far the ripple had already spread. Messages were being sent. Notes were being compared. Stories were aligning in ways they never had before. Mira's quiet strength had awakened something in others. The conflict was no longer contained within that glass room. As the meeting ended, nothing was resolved. No conclusions were drawn. No consequences announced. But the balance of power had shifted again, more sharply this time. The polished man walked out stiffly, his composure barely intact. The manager followed, deep in thought. Mira stayed behind for a moment, alone in the room. She looked at her reflection in the glass. The same quiet woman stared back at her. But now the silence around her felt different. It wasn't dismissal anymore. It was attention. She knew the hardest part was still ahead. When truth begins to surface, resistance often grows louder. People protect themselves when they feel exposed. The next steps would be messy, complicated, and uncomfortable. Mira understood that. She was ready for it. As she left the room and stepped back into the office, conversation stopped again. Eyes followed her. Not with pity. Not with curiosity. With recognition. The quiet woman had shifted the ground beneath them all. And the storm she had quietly prepared for was only just beginning. The days that followed felt heavier than everything that came before. The office no longer pretended nothing was wrong. Meetings were shorter. Emails were more careful. People chose their words like they mattered now because they did. Mira moved through it all with the same calm presence, but inside she felt the weight of momentum. Once truth starts moving, it doesn't stop easily. An internal review was announced.
Let's focus on our key
officially.
objectives for
No
this
dramatic
quarter.
statements, no public blame. Just a notice that processes were being examined and conversations would be had. For some, it was relief. For others, it was panic. The polished man tried to maintain his composure, but cracks showed more clearly with each passing day. His stories began to contradict each other. His confidence turned sharp, defensive. Mira was called in more than once. Not as an accuser but as a witness. She answered questions honestly without embellishment. Dates, facts, observations. She didn't speculate. She didn't assume intent. That restraint gave her words weight. The people listening could feel it. This wasn't personal. This was precise. Others were called in too. Those quiet conversations Mira never knew about came into the light. Different perspectives, same patterns. Small things that had been ignored on their own now formed a clear picture together. The conflict that once felt subtle now stood solid and undeniable. When the final meeting came, it wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The manager sat across from the polished man, documents neatly stacked between them. Mira was there too, invited not as support but as presence. The room felt tense but grounded. This wasn't chaos. This was reckoning. The conclusions were laid out calmly. Responsibilities had been misrepresented. Credit had been taken unfairly. Trust had been broken. The polished man listened, his expression unreadable, until the words finally settled. He tried one last time to explain, to soften the outcome, to reframe events. But the room had moved past persuasion. Truth had already taken its place. The decision was clear. His position would end. Not immediately dramatic but definitively. Accountability, not humiliation. Consequences, not cruelty. The conflict that had been building for so long resolved itself not with shouting, but with silence. A different kind of silence. One that followed clarity. As he stood to leave, the polished man looked at Mira. Not with anger. Not with blame. With something closer to disbelief. He realized then that her quiet had never been absence. It had been patience. And patience, when paired with truth, is powerful. When the door closed behind him, the room exhaled. In the days that followed, the office slowly adjusted. Roles shifted. Conversations changed. There was relief, but also reflection. People began to notice who had been steady all along. Mira didn't seek recognition. She didn't need it. But it found her anyway, quietly. Her manager spoke to her one afternoon, thanking her for her integrity. For her restraint. For not using truth as a weapon. He admitted his own mistakes, something she hadn't expected. That honesty surprised her more than any apology could have. For the first time, Mira felt seen, not as quiet, but as strong. Life outside the office changed too. People spoke to her differently. With respect. With curiosity. Some even asked how she stayed so calm. Mira smiled and said she listened more than she spoke. It was true. It always had been. Felt like an ending. A satisfying one. The conflict resolved. The balance restored. The quiet woman finally acknowledged. But just when everything seemed settled, something unexpected surfaced. Mira received an email late one evening. The sender was unfamiliar. The message was short but unsettling. It thanked her. Not for standing up, but for opening a door. The writer explained that the situation had encouraged them to look deeper into other areas, other patterns that went beyond one office, one person. Things that had been hidden under confidence and silence alike. Attached were documents Mira had never seen before. She read through them slowly, her expression unchanged but her mind sharp. The scope was larger than she realized. The conflict she thought had ended was only one layer. Her quiet act had triggered something wider. A chain reaction. Mira closed her laptop and sat back, the room dim around her. She didn't feel overwhelmed. She felt clear. The final twist wasn't that she had won. It was that her silence had never been about one moment or one place. It was about awakening awareness. In herself. In others. The quiet woman hadn't just changed her story. She had changed the way people listened. And as Mira looked out into the night, she knew this wasn't truly the end. It was a beginning. One shaped not by noise or force but by calm strength and truth. The kind of power that never announces itself. The kind you should never underestimate. The days after that email felt quieter but not empty. Mira didn't rush to respond or act. She had learned that silence, when used with intention, creates space for understanding. She read through the documents again the next morning with fresh eyes. They weren't accusations or demands. They were patterns, familiar in a way that made her pause. Different names, different places, same behaviors. The realization settled slowly. What happened in her office wasn't an isolated moment. It was a reflection of something larger. She replied to the email with care. Not with promises or bold statements, just acknowledgement. She thanked the sender for trusting her and said she would take time to think. That honesty mattered. Mira knew now that leadership doesn't always mean taking charge immediately. Sometimes it means choosing responsibility over reaction. At work, changes continued to take shape. A new structure was introduced, more transparent than before. Feedback channels opened. People who had once stayed quiet began speaking up, not loudly but confidently. Mira noticed how often her name came up in conversations she wasn't part of. Not as a symbol of rebellion but as an example of quiet strength. That made her uncomfortable at first. She never wanted to be placed on a pedestal. But she accepted that stories grow once they leave your hands. The coworker who had admired her from afar finally sat with her during lunch one day. She thanked Mira for showing her that being calm didn't mean being weak. That you didn't have to change your nature to stand your ground. Mira listened, touched more than she showed. That conversation mattered more to her than any formal recognition. The manager kept his word. He made changes not just to systems but to how he listened. He invited perspectives he had ignored before. He learned to pause instead of pushing forward. Watching that shift, Mira felt something soften inside her. Accountability, she realized, wasn't about punishment. It was about growth. Outside of work, life felt lighter. Mira walked through town with a different awareness now. People greeted her warmly, some with curiosity, others with quiet respect. She didn't change how she dressed or spoke. She didn't need to. Her presence had changed because her relationship with herself had changed. She trusted her instincts now. Trusted her voice even when it chose silence. She thought often about the polished man. Not with anger but with reflection. She understood how easy it is to confuse confidence with character, control with leadership. She hoped he would learn from what happened. Whether he did or not was no longer her responsibility. Letting go of that burden felt like freedom. As for the wider issue hinted at in the documents, Mira didn't face it alone. She shared what she had with the right people, carefully and responsibly. Conversations began. Not public, not dramatic, but necessary. Others stepped forward, some quietly, some hesitantly. Mira realized then that her role wasn't to lead the charge, but to show that it was safe to begin. Weeks passed. Then months. The tension that once filled the air faded into something steadier. Trust rebuilt slowly, honestly. Mira continued her work with the same focus she always had, but now her contributions were acknowledged. Not because she demanded it but because people had learned to look beyond noise. One evening she returned to her apartment and stood by the window again just like she used to. The town lights glowed softly. Life felt familiar but deeper. She thought about the journey, about how long she had been preparing without realizing it. Every overlooked moment, every quiet observation, every choice to wait instead of react had shaped her path. The biggest lesson wasn't that silence is powerful. It was that knowing when to use your voice matters just as much. Mira had learned to honor both. She didn't abandon her quiet nature. She embraced it fully, understanding now that it was never a limitation. People often talk about strong women as loud, bold, unbreakable. Mira knew strength could also look like patience, clarity, and calm. Could look like listening. Like choosing truth over ego. Like standing firm without raising your voice. As her story settled into memory for those who witnessed it, it became something more than an office conflict. It became a reminder. A reminder that underestimating a quiet woman is a mistake. That silence is not absence. That power doesn't always announce itself. Mira turned away from the window, feeling at peace. There were still challenges ahead. Life always has them. But she trusted herself now to meet them in her own way. And that, she knew, was the real victory.